Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope that this show is something that you look forward to checking in with every single week. Episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcasts to get you ready for working in the yard and all the chores that you need to do on the weekend. So make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. And this show also airs on the radio here in Utah on the weekend. So if you are catching us on 860 AM KKAT, you can always go to Apple Podcasts and look up and listen to all of our past episodes. This is episode 20. And as always, let us know what you would like to see on Gardening Utah. You can message us on Instagram. Our handle is @GardeningUtah, and we can have one of our experts answer your question on an upcoming show. Okay, so on today's show, we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite things on earth, which is homegrown tomatoes. I'm going to be giving you guys some unique ways that you can preserve your harvest so that you can bring in that homegrown tomato flavor to your kitchen and enjoy it all year long. Of course, depending on how many tomatoes you grew. So if you're crazy like me, you may have upwards of 80 tomato plants. I'm not going to give you the exact number because then I sound really crazy. Or maybe you go to the farmer's market and you pick up a bunch of tomatoes to preserve throughout the season. I'm going to go through some unique ways that you may not have thought of that are really, really time-saving, but also completely and totally delicious. So I'm really excited because one of my favorite things is obviously gardening, which is why I have this show, but I love to cook with homegrown vegetables and fruits, and I love to preserve the harvest and really enjoy that garden flavor all year long. So I do quite a bit of preserving. This is a really busy time of year for me, especially because everything is popping off in the garden. The green beans, the tomatoes, my counter is chock full of them, and I still have to go pick more. The squash, so much zucchini. And if you're like me, you're kind of putting some in a bag and you're tiptoeing over to the neighbor's house and setting down a few zucchinis and then ringing the doorbell and running away so that they can have some garden goodness as well. Anyway, so much going on this time of year and it's just really, really busy in the kitchen. But I have, through the years, discovered some really time-saving ways to make it as quick as possible. Now, of course, I'm a canner. I love to can. I love to can tomatoes, but some of the things I'm going to be discussing today are not canning. So we're not talking about canning. It's primarily talking about freezing, but I'm going to give you a couple hacks and some ideas that you may never heard of. So if you are overridden with tomatoes like me, or if you go and buy a bunch at the farmer's market to preserve throughout the year, this is the show for you. We're going to discuss tomatoes, we're going to discuss zucchini, and lots of tips and tricks for the kitchen. So we're going to get into all of that in a minute, but first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is, when do you pick your watermelon and how do you know they're ripe? Well, first of all, we've been getting this question a lot lately because it is that time of year when the watermelons start to go ripe. Now, there's nothing worse than planting this beautiful watermelon and watering it all year long and watching it grow with anticipation. You cannot wait to cut into that delicious fruit, only to find that it is just not ripe yet. Well, I'm going to give you 3 ways to know that it is time to pick. And this is first and foremost, this is the most important part of the picking process. So when you're tempted to pick the watermelon, you have to look at what's called the tendril. Now, what is the tendril? It's just off of the green stem and right underneath the first leaf, and it's kind of like a curly cube. It's like this curly little green tendril, and quite often it's wrapped around something. If it is green, leave the watermelon, don't touch it, don't disturb it at all. That is the number one sign that the watermelon plant is still feeding that watermelon. As soon as it starts to go brown, that's when you know it's getting close. So if the tendril is green, let it be, let it continue to grow and continue to ripen. If it is totally brown, then you're going to want to look at these other next steps. So the thumping method, I'm not a fan of. I have never quite figured out when you thump a watermelon, whether it's in the ground or in the store, whether or not it's ripe. It's just not fail-safe because it kind of depends on the type of watermelon you have. So, but you can just pick it up a little bit without disturbing the stem and thump it with the palm of your hand. And sometimes when they're ripe, they'll make a really hollow sound. But again, I've never perfected that method, but I usually do give it a thump just to make sure, because sometimes it'll give you a clue. Now, the last thing that you're going to want to know is the surface color of the watermelon is going to get pretty dull when it's ripe. So you're going to want to notice that, and then the underside of that watermelon, when you pick up the underbelly and you kind of turn it and look at it, the portion that's touching the ground, if it's white, let it be. But it starts to turn a light green or yellow when it is time to pick. So those are the main things to look for. Check the underbelly, see if it's turning green or yellow, and check that tendril right off of the first stem. And if that's turning brown, you're going to get a really, really delicious, sweet watermelon.
And that was the tip of the week.
Never miss a tip for your garden. Never miss a tip for your garden. And never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
So speaking of watermelon, I have some amazing watermelon plants this year that have just done phenomenal. I grow 3 different kinds of watermelon typically. I've got my favorite number 1 watermelon in the world is called Orange Glow. And it's absolutely delicious. It's an orange watermelon, and it's the sweetest, most amazing watermelon I've ever tried in my life. It's quite large, so it takes a while, but I've got 3 or 4 that are getting really, really close. So I go out and I'm looking at that tendril like every other day, just going, I can't wait, because they're just so, so, so amazing. And I love sharing those Orange Glow seeds with friends of mine. I know my brother's got some, and some other friends of mine that I've given watermelon seeds to, and they're doing really well in their garden as well. And then I've got a Crimson Sweet, and I've got some Sugar Babies. So I'm going to be doing a garden tour on Instagram Live this weekend at some point. So have a look at the Gardening Utah page, and you'll be able to hopefully at some point see a little bit of what I'm growing in my neck of the woods. Okay, so when we come back after this break, we're going to get into all of my tips and tricks around preserving tomatoes, and I guarantee you'll learn something you didn't know already, and you'll be inspired. So right after this break, all about preserving your harvest. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. And in this segment, we're going to be talking about my very favorite thing, which is homegrown tomatoes. Are you with me? Is there anything better than picking a warm tomato from the plant, bringing it inside, getting a little piece of toast going, putting on some mayonnaise on a fresh piece of warm toast, slicing up that tomato, putting on some molten or sea salt? Oh my gosh, there's nothing better. I'm curious, how do you like your homegrown tomatoes? How do you like your tomato sandwich? I'm going to do a post on our Facebook page and our Gardening Utah Instagram page. Look us up and tell me. Go there and comment and tell me how you like your homegrown tomato sandwich. So I really want to know. Some people use cottage cheese. Some people don't like mayo. Some people like butter. Tell me how you make your tomato sandwich. Okay. Aside from tomato sandwiches, I'm going to be focusing on different and unique ways and quick and easy ways to preserve your tomato harvest. Now, I'm not going to talk about canning in this episode because I promised this would be some really different and quick and easy ways to really take advantage of making sure that your tomato harvest can last as long as possible. Now, my goal is always to grow enough tomatoes that our family will eat for an entire year. Yes, I am serious, an entire year, which is why I have 87 tomato plants. I know. Believe me, my kitchen counter right now is completely chock full of tomatoes. I'm going to be so busy this weekend. In fact, when you're listening to this show on the radio this weekend, I promise you that I'm in my kitchen and I am doing the very thing that I'm going to be talking to you about right now. Okay, so my favorite, we're going to start with sauce type tomatoes like Romas or San Marzanos, and I'll tell you how I like to preserve those. Again, I love to can tomatoes. There's a difference between canning and freezing, and I think there's a pro and con to both, and I love to have a bunch of canned tomatoes, and I love to have a bunch of frozen tomatoes, and let me tell you why. I think you need to have the diversity, especially when you're preserving food. You have to have the diversity between the two, because what if the power goes out and you're on vacation and you're not able to start up a generator or something, or you don't have a generator? You could waste and ruin an entire year's worth of your tomato harvest or anything else that you've preserved from your garden just because the power went out, and that would be completely devastating. So that's where the benefit of canning really comes in, is because it's not reliant on any power whatsoever. That being said, one of the downsides to canning, in my opinion, is that what happens if there's an earthquake? Okay, and they all break into a million pieces. Now, that might be pretty far reaching, and again, that's a lot less likely to happen than losing power and everything defrosting. But I'm telling you what, on March 18th this year, when we had that 5.4 rocker, I'll tell you, once I realized the family was safe and, surveyed the damage, which, by the way, was a bunch of pictures that fall off the wall and broke, like the glass broke. That's what happened in my house primarily, other than, lots of things falling on the floor. But as far as I went down to my cellar, my storage room, just to see and make sure that my canning jars didn't fall off the shelf and crack. So anyway, I got lucky on that. Anyway, okay, I digress. But let's talk about freezing tomatoes. And specifically, this part is going to be about the sauce tomatoes like San Marzanos or Romas or any type of variety like that. Now, the reason why people love these particular sauce tomatoes is because they're more meaty and they're less watery. And so they make amazing, amazing spaghetti sauce, marinara sauce, pizza sauce, any kind of sauce, as they would say in Italy. Now, the San Marzano tomato, those are the ones that it looks just like a Roma, but it has a little point to it. And those are the variety that are in those yellow cans, those 28-ounce cans that you see at the store of Certo. Now, it's a really prized variety that does, in my opinion, and obviously many, many others, have a deeper, more rich flavor than aroma. And so those are the expensive cans. So a can of Certo will run you between $3.99 and $4.99, depending on where you're buying it. And so that's why I grow San Marzanos, is because I really like to have that extra flavor, but I love to have them in my home and make whatever I want to make instead of spending $3.99 in a can of Certo. And one of the reasons I do grow so many tomatoes, if I haven't mentioned yet, I have 87 plants this year, long story, that I think I might have mentioned on a different episode as to why I have that many tomatoes this year. I typically don't have that many plants, but with the San Marzanos, there's just a huge difference in flavor. Not just with San Marzano and the Romas, but with tomatoes homegrown in general. Because to me, it's the one vegetable, in my opinion, that is the biggest change between eating homegrown than in the store. So that's one reason I grow tomatoes. And another reason is they're quite expensive. I mean, if you think about it, you are really saving money. If your family goes through a lot of tomatoes, you really can truly save money by preserving your own tomatoes. So for me, it's just a great bang for your buck and a bang for your time if you think about it, because, growing homegrown tomatoes, obviously you're winning in flavor and you're winning as far as price in comparison to something like, let's say, jalapenos that are really inexpensive in the store to buy and quite honestly don't taste that much different, even though I am guilty as charged for growing a ton, and I mean a ton of jalapenos and a ton of peppers. I will talk about peppers in a different segment of this show. So this, what I really want to tell everybody is how I preserve my tomatoes, because I do, aside from canning, I do a few different methods that a lot of people I realize don't do. And when I get to talking to somebody, they're like, I had no idea. So I wanted to share this with the Gardening Utah listeners. So as far as how I preserve my sauce tomatoes like Romas or San Marzanos, the main tool that I use is the cheese grater. And you're thinking, wait, a cheese grater? Are you kidding me? No, I'm not kidding. Okay, here's what I do. You get either quart size freezer bags or gallon size freezer bags, totally depending on how many tomatoes you typically use in a recipe or, when you go to utilize tomatoes. I do gallon size bags. Now, you cut your tomato in half, you get the cheese grater on a cheese board or a cutting board, and you start to grate the tomato through the cheese grater. And the goal is to get the skin off. So you grate the tomato down to the skin. This is a fast and easy way to get the skin off your tomato instead of blanching, okay? And then you end up with this amazing pulp that you don't need to cook before you freeze. So the cheese grater, that is one of the ways that I preserve my Romas or San Marzanos. And then I like to measure out exactly. So I will measure 4 cups at a time, and then I will put 4 cups in a freezer bag. Then I will take that quart or gallon size bag of tomatoes, and it's basically just the pulp of the tomato, and I will lay it flat on a cookie sheet inside the freezer and freeze it flat, okay? Because then you can stack a ton of these gallon-sized bags or quart-sized bags on top of each other and take up less room in your freezer. So that is, and of course, always take a Sharpie and write on the bag before you put the tomatoes in the bag, whatever variety is San Marzano, 28 ounces, and then I put the month and the year. Obviously, we try to use those up within 6 months, and most of the time we do, but it always makes sense because you will never remember when you actually, trust me, you'll never remember when you actually processed that bag of tomatoes. So that is one really quick and easy way that I will preserve my tomatoes for sauce. And then one evening when you're like, what to make for dinner, and the kids just want spaghetti, great. We're going to make homegrown spaghetti from our tomatoes from our garden, and it feels so good for me because I just love extending the harvest, eating from our own yard all year long. It's more nutritious, it's less expensive, and it's such a rush for me. I love nothing more than preparing something for my family with something that we have grown in our own garden. So that is one tip, is shredding the tomatoes with a cheese grater to get the skin off and freezing them in bags at the exact portions that you're going to use. Now, for me, I always do 4 cups because that's almost always the amount that each recipe will ask for. And that's what I will use to start either a spaghetti sauce, a pizza sauce, even a salsa, or, throw it in a soup, make, any kind of soup. It's a great base for any type of vegetable or beef soup. And it's a great base, obviously, for tomato soup and that kind of a thing. So love to do it like that. Now, let's say super busy. You're realizing it's Sunday evening. You've got a table full of tomatoes and you got to start work on Monday morning, which is typically my story. And you just don't have the time to do the process that I mentioned, although that doesn't take so long. The other tip and trick that I do there is I will just freeze the tomato whole. Now you're wondering, well, wait, don't you have to blanch the tomato? Don't you have to peel the skin off? No, you don't. And here is why. It's because when you think about it, tomatoes are mostly water. And so that's what's freezing. And when they defrost, the skin pops right off, okay? So it's really easy to just take those whole tomatoes, and once they're defrosted, that skin just pops right off. So if you are in a hurry and you need to get your tomatoes put up and you want to preserve them and you don't have time to do the process I just mentioned, you can freeze them whole. I just wash them well, and I take a knife and I just score the end with an X, okay? And that just makes it easier when you're defrosting your tomato to just pull that skin right off. It is amazing. Now, with doing that, the number one trick is to first freeze the tomatoes separately before you put them in a bag. So just take those tomatoes, separate them a little bit from each other, put them on a cookie sheet, and then put them in the bag when they're frozen and take as much air out of that bag as possible. That way, when you go to grab a tomato or 3 or 5 to make your sauce or whatever you need to make, any recipe that calls for tomato, you're just opening the bag and grabbing 1 or 2, and since they were frozen separately, they don't freeze solid. Okay, now when we come back after this break, I'm going to talk to you about my quick and easy way to make marinara or spaghetti sauce. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time.
We are supported by ProgressivePlants.com. They are the experts that the professionals go to for all things plants. Progressive Plants has over 1 million plants at their 100-acre nursery up in Copperton. And you can shop those plants from right at home at ProgressivePlants.com. They are your neighbor's next door and experts at helping you choose the perfect and unique plants that will thrive in your location. Plan your perfect yard. Visit ProgressivePlants.com today.
She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and today we're talking about my very favorite subject, which is homegrown tomatoes, and especially preserving those homegrown tomatoes all year long, and different and easy ways that you may not have heard of to preserve your harvest. Now, in the last segment, I talked about different ways that you can freeze your sauce tomatoes like Romas or San Marzanos. And if you're listening on the radio and you happen to miss that segment, you can always find our show also on Apple Podcast. And by the way, you can binge any past episode of Gardening Utah as well. Okay, so I promised in that last segment that we were going to talk about a very quick and easy way to do the most delicious marinara sauce. And this is totally tried and true, meaning I do this on repeat almost every other day during preserving season because I do grow so many freaking tomatoes. So now for me, I don't usually use my sauce tomatoes for this recipe only because I like to preserve them the other way that I mentioned in the past segment. So for this, I'm usually using tomatoes that maybe came out a little bit cracked and they need to be used right away. Or maybe, just have excess of certain heirlooms. I grow a lot of heirloom tomatoes, much more than we can just slice up and eat on tomato sandwiches. So those are the types of tomatoes I'm usually using for this kind of a sauce. And I have everything from black brandy wines to chestnut chocolates to Amish slicers. I have so many different varieties of, tomatoes that you normally wouldn't can. And that is what this is perfect for. Okay, so the way I do it is you want to get maybe like a 9x13 rectangular baking tray, but you're wanting to get a baking tray that is high because it is going to splash all on the edges. And the goal with this particular recipe is caramelization, okay? Because you're making that tomato completely caramelize and turn into the most rich and the most delicious flavor. And let me tell you, your home will end up smelling like an Italian nonny's house because it is so delicious. So take the tomatoes you want to use and you're going to want to fill that baking tray with tomatoes. I don't necessarily stack them, but I pack them in super, super tight. And you can peel them, but you do not have to. It depends, because some tomatoes are just super easy to peel as you're going through and you're cutting out the middle and whatnot. But some aren't. So I just kind of go with the flow. There's no right or wrong here. So as I'm peeling that, or as I'm cutting up the tomato, obviously you're going to core the tomato and take out that, the stem end. But I, in most cases, just slice the tomatoes into fourths, depending on the size. And then I just start stacking them in the baking tray. And obviously they're super, super juicy and you don't want to lose any of that juice. So I typically don't do it over a cutting board. I just like to cut the tomatoes in my hand right over the dish so that all the juices drip right into the baking dish. Then once you've got your entire baking dish packed with tomatoes, not necessarily stacked, but all lined up super close together, I will take 4 or 5 garlic cloves. Now, don't take them out of the shell. I leave the garlic cloves in the shell, and then I just kind of sprinkle those in the tomato juice, just kind of put them between the tomatoes, separate them around the pan. Then I take basil and oregano, fresh always, if you can. If you can't, you can sprinkle dry in there, but try to use fresh, especially if you've got it in the garden, my goodness. Now, for me, I do have those herbs in the garden, and so when I go to cut them, I don't pick the leaves off. I use it as a great time to sort of prune my basil, if you will, because you don't really want your basil to go to seed through the year because then it just stops producing. So it's totally okay if your basil has started to go to seed and you've got flowers on there, leave it. So what I do is I will always pick the basil above a node where you can tell that it's going to branch off to the sides. And then I leave it together because think about it, those stems and those flowers have a ton of flavor in them. And it's so easy to just leave them together. So, and I do the same with the oregano. Just wash it really good. And then I just stick it whole. Don't even pull off the leaves, like I said. And I get that down in there. Sometimes I'll even layer the dish with the herbs first and then put the tomatoes on top. There's really no right or wrong here. And the reason I leave it together is because I take it out and I don't leave the herbs in the sauce when I process it at the end, okay? So that's why I leave it all together. A, because the stems and the flowers have so much flavor. And B, because it makes it so easy to just grab it, drip everything off of it, and then throw it away. Okay, so get your herbs packed in there. Again, I don't really follow a recipe. I just eyeball it, but the more the better. So oregano and basil, stick that in there. You've got your garlic, you've got your tomatoes all in there, packed together. Now is a really big key is olive oil. You're going to want to sprinkle on olive oil. Maybe it's a 1/4 cup or so, but you're just going to sprinkle that on there for sure. And then you're going to want to get like a really good salt, not an iodized salt, but like a sea salt or a Himalayan or maybe a molten salt, which is usually what I use. And sprinkle that on super, super good. And that is it. Other than sometimes I will add an onion. So onion is totally optional. My husband doesn't love onions, give him heartburn. So I usually just either do the minimum onion or not at all. So totally up to you. But if you do use an onion, just cut it in fourths and then just kind of stick those in between. Because what you're trying to do is get these flavors as they're cooking to kind of mesh together. So once you've done that, then it's ready to go. I put it in the oven at 350, and you can also do the heat higher. It just kind of depends on the caramelization that you want, but stick that in the oven at 350 and let it roast for at least an hour. So sometimes it takes an hour and 10. It just kind of depends, but what you're going for is it's sizzling, it's bubbling really good, and that the tops of the tomatoes are really getting that dark roasted char look to them, okay? And now there's really no right answer as well with the ingredients. If you've got some peppers you want to put in there and you like those flavors, go for it. If you want it to be a little bit spicy, add maybe some Thai peppers or any kind of, a cayenne, whatever you want. This is up to you, but I'm just giving you the basics. And when that is really good and caramelized, take it out, let it cool down, and put it in the blender. Blend that all together, of course, after you've taken the garlics out of the cloves, and then after you've taken the herbs out. Blend it together super good, and I am telling you what, It will be the best sauce you ever had, or I'll give you your money back. After this break, we're going to continue on with more about preserving the harvest. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and today we have been discussing my favorite topic, homegrown tomatoes, and how you can preserve those to enjoy them all year long. And I've been giving different ways to do it than the traditional canning and some different methods that you may not have heard of. Now, a lot of people don't realize that you can preserve cherry tomatoes. There's a couple different ways you can do that, because a lot of times when we plant those cherry tomatoes, we get so excited we're just going to go out and eat them all off the plant. But then guess what? All of a sudden, you don't have 10 cherry tomatoes, you have hundreds, which is what I have right now. I have got so many cherry tomatoes. I went a little crazy this year at the Wasatch Community Gardens tomato plant sale. And I wanted to try all the different cherries that I had never tried before, like Sweet Aperitif and Reisentraub, and ones that I had just never heard of beside the yellow pear that I had already started. I have red currants that are just teeny tiny ones that are amazing. And just the Gardener's Delight, which is a tried and true, amazing heirloom cherry tomato. But I wanted to try these new varieties. And so I am overrun with cherry tomatoes. And I knew it was going to happen. You just get so excited at the beginning of the season, It's like, oh, I want to try that one and that one and that one and that one. That's just how I am. And now I have so many cherry tomatoes. So here's a couple ways that you may not have heard of that you can do with your cherry tomatoes. One, you really can freeze your cherry tomatoes. A lot of people don't realize that. It's super easy. Put them on, like I said earlier, you definitely want to freeze them separately first. So put them on a cookie sheet, evenly spaced out, get them frozen, and then put them in a bag so that you can pull out the ones you want when you need them. Now, it's not going to be anything like eating them fresh, completely opposite, but it is perfect for putting in sauces or, adding them to, soups and that kind of a thing. So really great way is to freeze them. But I want to make you guys the heroes at upcoming, assuming we can have upcoming gatherings, but coming up at, let's say, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, I'm going to give you guys a way that you can preserve your cherry tomatoes and also have an incredible appetizer that you can take to any gathering this holiday season. So I tested this last weekend and I am so excited. Now, all of these are going to be on the Gardening Utah Instagram so that you can have visualization of what I'm talking about that I did in my very own kitchen, which you can always look up on Instagram. I have a hashtag for the things that I cook and stuff. It's called F5, so like the refresh key on a Mac. So F5 Kitchen. So you can look up anytime kind of what I'm up to in the kitchen, because I will throw it on Instagram and use that hashtag. Okay, that being said, here is a great way to make this appetizer. First, you're just very similar to the marinara sauce that I talked about in the last segment. You're going to line your baking sheet. So you're wanting to get a deep baking sheet, like a 9 by 13 baking dish. And you're going to want to line it with the cherry tomatoes. And in this case, you can stack them up a little bit. And just pack them in there. Lots and lots and lots and lots of olive oil. You're going to have to eyeball it. This really isn't like a specific recipe. But eyeball it, and you're going to want, about 1/4 of an inch of olive oil in the bottom of the pan, and you're going to want every single cherry tomato to be coated with it. So you can mix it up a little bit if you want as well. Then you're going to want to add your basil and oregano, similar to the way I discussed in the last segment about, I leave the stems on and then I pull the entire thing out when it's done cooking. So just bury those in there as well so that the flavors can start to mesh. And then a lot of like sea salt or Himalayan salt or Maldon salt. I am a big fan of Maldon salt. So I definitely use that. Just cake that on, I mean, not cake it on, but, within reason, but salt it really well. And then you're going to add the secret ingredient, an entire head, and I'm serious, an entire head of garlic. Now, you're not going to peel it, get the outside off, of course, but just, you can cut off the bottom if you want. You can even cut off the top a little bit, but leave the garlic intact and set it in the center. Just bury it there in the center of the baking tray because you're going to want the garlic to roast inside the shell because you're going to pop all of it out and it pops out super, super easy once it's cooked. Okay, so then you're putting this in the oven once it's all ready to go, and you're going to roast it at 375. And it usually takes an hour. It might take an hour and a half. But the goal here is color, caramelization. That is what you're wanting. It's taking all of the amazing sugars in those cherry tomatoes and it's caramelizing them. And let me tell you, it is delicious. Now, the reason you put more olive oil in this than you do that marinara I mentioned is we're actually not going to blend this up. Once you take it out of the oven, take those herbs out, like I mentioned, pop the garlic out of the cloves, or the cloves out of the shell, and then let it cool. Now, I like to store mine in mason jars inside the fridge. Now, this is an incredible appetizer for crackers and cream cheese. My goodness, it's absolutely delicious. But you can put it on toast, you can put it on pizza, you can put it on bagels, whatever you want. I'm telling you, the flavors, I mean, it's so simple, but it is so delicious. And it's such a fun way to preserve your harvest because it will last, because of the extra oil that you're putting in here, it will last up to 3 weeks in the fridge. Like I said, I store mine in a mason jar. You can put it in a Pyrex bowl, doesn't matter. And then you can also freeze it. Same method I talked about earlier. In this case, you'd probably only need a quart size freezer bag or maybe a gallon, depending on how much you make. No judgment here. But first, I like to lay it out, even with the olive oil, on a baking sheet, let it freeze individually, and then you're going to kind of pack it into one of those freezer bags. And when you're coming up on one of those holidays where you need to take a great appetizer, I'm telling you, you're bringing a piece of your garden and all the goodness with you. Let it defrost inside the bag. That's really important to let it defrost inside the bag because that really makes sure that condensation disperses in a way that retains a lot of the flavor. And then put it in a beautiful dish and take some crackers and cream cheese. I'm telling you what. You will be so thanked by all of the people that you feed with this because I'm telling you, it is absolutely delicious. Okay, so those are the main ways, we've kind of gone through ways to preserve your sauce tomatoes like Roma's and San Marzanos, and I gave you that marinara sauce recipe that's absolutely amazing that you can use for all of your other tomatoes. And then this recipe for cherry tomatoes or just freezing the cherry tomatoes. Those are just some easy, quick ways that you can preserve the harvest and enjoy all year long. That's a little bit different than your traditional canning and stuff like that. So I want to know from you, what are some of your amazing tried and true recipes that you use to preserve your tomato harvest? I would love to know. Either tag Gardening Utah if you post it on Instagram, or go post it on our Facebook page. Share your recipes with us because I would love to share some with our listeners as well in future episodes. So anyway, would love to hear yours. And again, go to our Instagram at Gardening Utah or our Facebook page and tell us, like I said earlier in the episode, tell us how you like your tomato sandwich. Mine is toasted white bread, Grandma's sycamore, of course, a really thick slice of tomato, mayonnaise, and some Molden salt. That is my tomato sandwich, but I want to know what yours is. Okay, so we've talked tomatoes. Why don't we talk a little bit about squash? Now, I grow so much squash in the garden, between summer squash like zucchinis, tons of different varieties that I actually don't even have one normal zucchini plant. All my zucchini plants are like an Italian caserta or a Mexican tatumi because I just really like to utilize different types because you can get regular zucchini anywhere. So I like to kind of mix it up and get different varieties. And, zucchini bread and all those things, we make a lot of that. So many different ways you can utilize your zucchinis and your summer squash. But with freezing, how I like to do it is, it's so, a lot of people do this. Shred the zucchini with a cheese grater, and I like to set it out on a cookie sheet like always, let it freeze separately, and then put it in a freezer bag, and you try to get all the water out, as much of the water out as possible. And my big tip here is always freeze it in the amount that you're going to need for a recipe. So if you know that you want to make zucchini bread in November, and trust me, you will, it's the perfect time of year, I really like to look at what my recipe is, and then I freeze the exact amount that I'm going to need. And I always write on the bag, put the date and the measurement so that you know as you're going through your freezer, okay, this is the oldest bag that I have. I'll use that one first. So I always like to use the oldest first and, get that baking, going. Now, with zucchini as well, if you need to use up some and you're not into making bread, a great way is to add that shredded zucchini to soups. And I'm telling you, it really thickens the sauce, like a vegetable soup or maybe a beef soup, whatever kind of soup you're making. The zucchini is a really great add-in to your soups. And one last thing that I'm going to try with my zucchini this year that I've never done, and I saw this online and I don't remember where, but it was in some Facebook group, but it was called zucchini pineapple. Now, I've never tried it before. Maybe some of our listeners have before, but apparently it's a way where you're canning your zucchini, but you're canning it with pineapple juice. And for whatever reason, I guess the zucchini magically turns into pineapple flavor somehow, and kids can't even tell the difference. So what a great way. I read that it's this amazing way to, add pineapple on pizza. But it's actually zucchini, which I love pineapple on pizza. I'm one of those people. So definitely going to be giving that a try this weekend. And maybe I'll bring you guys along with me on the Gardening Utah Instagram page, because it's got to be done. I'm just kind of the type of person where when I see like a brand new way that I don't previously know of to preserve something, I have to try it. And so I'm really excited to give it a try. Maybe I'll report back on next week's episode. And of course, I'll put it on Instagram. So one last tip that I forgot to mention when we talked earlier about using a cheese grater to grate your tomatoes to then all the way down to the skin, so you save this, or so that you don't have to blanch your tomatoes before freezing them. The thing I forgot to mention is I actually like to dry those tomato skins in the oven, just on a really, really low setting. I suppose you could do it outside on a hot day as well. But dehydrate or dry those tomato skins, and then I grind them up in like the little magic bullet or the Ninja. I grind them up into tomato powder, and I will put them in a spice jar. And then anytime I'm making some kind of soup and I need to thicken it up, that does call for tomatoes, I put in that dried tomato powder, fresh from the garden. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed this episode. I hope you're inspired to try something new and different with your garden preserves this year. I really hope that you try some of these recipes and that I've inspired you to do something new. So if you do, I would love for you to tag Gardening Utah in your Instagram post so that we can go and have a look. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of Gardening Utah. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
Progressive Plants is passionate about helping homeowners, expert gardeners, novices alike choose the correct plant for your soil. They don't just grow plants, they know plants. Let Progressive Plants help you today. Just go to progressiveplants.com and check out their wide selection. You can also go to the Design tab and look at the expert designers that they have that can help you plan your perfect yard. Visit progressiveplants.com today.